What if Goliath had won the battle? Imagine a world where the iron giant never fell, where Goliath, with his overwhelming strength and relentless gaze, defeated David on that battlefield. The stones that never struck his forehead now sealed the fate of an entire people. What would have happened if history had bowed to the giant's shadow? If Goliath had won, nothing would ever have been as we know it. Jerusalem would have been plunged into an oppressive silence, and the voices of the vanished leaders would have faded, would become forgotten echoes. But there is something even more disturbing. Ancient accounts speak of a secret the giant brought with him, a dark power capable of corrupting kings, altering destinies, and awakening horrors no one would dare imagine. In the end, what truly lies behind Goliath's victory may be more terrifying than the war itself. The story we know of David and Goliath is the one we've been told. But what if things had gone differently? What if the imposing and cruel giant had felled the young shepherd before he could throw his decisive stone? The battlefield would have become a scene of silent destruction, with a heavy air of fear and resignation. The armies of Israel would have scattered, and the name of Goliath would have spread like a shadow that swallowed cities and dreams. Leaders and soldiers accustomed to the courage of their heroes would have seen hope vanish before unforgiving eyes, before hands that did not hesitate. Every stone not thrown, every cry not heard, would have echoed in the memory of a people who would never forget the defeat. But there was something more beyond the physical, a feeling that this victory was not merely military, but symbolic, almost prophetic. The giant was not just flesh and blood. He carried within him a power that seemed to alter the very essence of the world, a harbinger that something ancient and dark was about to emerge, awaiting the right moment to reveal its true reach. The question few dared to ask began to take shape. How far could Goliath go if nothing stopped him? And what dark secrets did he carry, ready to infiltrate the history of a defenseless people? The Valley of Allah, which had once witnessed war songs and promises of victory, now seemed a place forgotten by God. Dust still hung in the air, mingled with the metallic smell of blood and the lingering fear. In Filtravain, the men's breath, the surrounding hills, silent and motionless, watched like ancient judges, accomplices in a defeat that should not have happened. The sky, shrouded in dense clouds, seemed lower, as if pressing the world down, suffocating any vestige of hope. No bird crossed the horizon. No wind dared break the heavy silence that had settled after David's fall. The Philistines remained motionless for a few moments, as if even they needed to confirm that the impossible had become reality. Then the sound of Goliath's armor echoed through the valley, each step marking territory, each movement reaffirming absolute dominion. On the other side, the army of Israel no longer saw a battlefield, but an open tomb. Abandoned tents, shields dropped on the ground, and pale faces betrayed a people who already felt conquered even before the invasion began. The earth itself seemed to react to the giant's presence as if recognizing in him something ancient, brutal, and inevitable. The atmosphere was not merely physical, it was psychological, spiritual, almost supernatural. Something had been broken in that valley, and it wasn't just bones or swords. It was the belief that the weak could overcome the strong, that faith could conquer brute force. From that moment on, the world seemed a darker place, and everyone felt that this victory would echo far beyond that silent field. At first, many believed that the defeat was just that, a devastating military loss, but limited to that fateful day. But it wasn't long before the first warning sign appeared, too subtle to ignore and too disturbing to explain. The night after Goliath's victory, bonfires lit by the Philistines went out for no apparent reason, as if the fire itself had been suffocated by something invisible. Soldiers reported identical dreams, even sleeping in different locations. All saw the giant walking among still intact Israelite cities, not as an ordinary conqueror, but as a silent judge, observing, choosing who should fall. On the Israelite side, shepherds claimed to hear heavy footsteps echoing in the empty fields, although no troops had yet advanced. Animals refused water. Children awoke screaming in the middle of the night, and elders felt a tightness in their chests, as if the air were becoming harder to breathe. Goliath's name began to be whispered not only with fear, but with something close to forced reverence. as if pronouncing it would draw his attention. Some priests tried to interpret the signs as coincidences, but their own eyes betrayed unease. There was something wrong with that victory, something that transcended the logic of war. The feeling was clear. The giant had not only won a battle, he had broken an invisible boundary, as if his survival had opened an ancient door, allowing something larger, darker, and hungrier to slowly infiltrate the world. And that was only the beginning. When the first sign was recognized, it was too late to pretend that nothing had changed. Among all who witnessed David's fall, there was someone whose presence almost went unnoticed, someone who neither wielded a sword nor wore armor. He was a young provisions carrier, sent to the valley only to observe and report the outcome of the battle. He was far enough away to survive, but close enough to see details others preferred to forget. His eyes followed the exact moment the stone missed its target, ricocheting uselessly off the metal of Goliath's helmet. He saw the giant's slow, cruel smile, not of relief, but of absolute certainty. When Goliath advanced and felled David, the silence that followed was so profound it seemed to have swallowed the sound of the world itself. The young man swore he had seen something impossible in that instant, a shadow that didn't correspond to any body, stretching beyond the giant as if something larger were behind him, watching through his eyes. After the battle, while the army scattered in panic, the witness remained paralyzed, feeling he had seen more than one man fall. In the following days, he tried to recount what he had witnessed, but his words always faltered at the same point, as if something prevented him from fully explaining it. At night, he would wake up in a cold sweat, hearing a deep voice repeat his name, calling him to remember. His sanity began to crumble, not from fear of war, but from the certainty that Goliath's victory had been accompanied by something that shouldn't exist. He was now the bearer of a secret no one wanted to hear, living proof that this battle was not won by force alone, but by something much older and more dangerous. The authorities of Israel tried to act quickly, not to confront the enemy, but to understand what had changed. Priests, scribes, and advisors to the king met in secret, away from the eyes of the people, seeking answers they dared not utter aloud. Strange accounts began to accumulate, cities surrendering even before the Philistines arrived, leaders abandoning their posts without explanation, and strong men refusing to bear arms, overcome by a formless fear. The investigation did not follow common war trails, but signs, symbols, and ancient forgotten records. Rarely consulted scrolls were retrieved from dusty vaults, speaking of giants not only as warriors, but as bearers of influence, figures who emerged in moments of rupture to test the world's balance. Each discovery made the situation more unsettling. It wasn't just Goliath who worried them, but the effect of his victory. The giant's name appeared associated with cycles of decay, the collapse of kingdoms, and prolonged divine silences. Some investigators began to suspect that David's defeat had interrupted a chain of events considered essential to maintaining order. Meanwhile, messengers sent to observe the Philistine camp returned pale, reporting that Goliath rarely slept, remaining awake for hours, motionless, staring at the horizon as if awaiting unseen instructions. The initial investigation brought no comfort, only a terrifying certainty. This was no passing crisis. Something had been unleashed, something that could not be undone with swords or alliances. And the more they investigated, the clearer it became that perhaps they shouldn't have sought answers. It was after the discovery of the object, something unexpected happened. The world began to fall silent. Not suddenly, but gradually, almost carefully. Prophets stopped receiving visions. Priests prayed for hours and received only the echo of their own voices. Ancient songs once sung to invoke protection lost their effect, sounding empty without spiritual weight. It was as if an invisible layer had interposed itself between heaven and earth. The silence was not an absence of sound, but an absence of response. In the fields, the wind no longer changed direction. In the cities, the bells rang, but no one felt solace. Even the Philistines, intoxicated by victory, began to realize that something was wrong. Goliath, now celebrated as invincible, had become reclusive. He spoke little, with short, emotionless phrases like someone merely carrying out orders he chose not to hear. His eyes seemed different, deeper, more distant, as if fixed on something no one else could see. Silence spread among the people as well. Families stopped arguing, children stopped laughing, and even fear seemed more contained, more resigned. Some said God had withdrawn. Others whispered that it wasn't withdrawal but containment, as if something had been released, and therefore the rest had been forced to be silent. The silence became the true sign that Goliath's victory had broken something essential, something that sustained the invisible balance of the world. It was during a silent incursion to the edges of the ancient battlefield that the object was found. Half buried in the earth, hardened by dried blood and the weight of history, it didn't resemble any known weapon. It wasn't a sword, nor a shield, nor a war ornament. It had the irregular shape of a black stone, too smooth to be natural, cold to the touch even under the scorching sun. Those who held it reported an immediate sensation of vertigo, as if time around them had slowed down. The object was located exactly where David had fallen. No Philistine claimed ownership, and Goliath never mentioned its existence. Priests asserted it was not part of any known ritual, but fragmented texts suggested artifacts used as seals, anchors between worlds, created not to kill, but to allow certain forces to remain. The most disturbing thing was not its appearance, but its behavior. At night, the object seemed to absorb the light of torches, projecting long, distorted shadows that moved on their own. Those who slept near it dreamed of ancient voices speaking of broken pacts and a champion who should not have won. When questioned, the witness paled upon seeing it, stating that the stone had not been there before the battle. The discovery raised a terrifying hypothesis. Perhaps Goliath's victory had not been merely skill or strength, but the result of something activated at that precise moment, something that demanded a price. What if that object was merely the physical vestige of a presence that now walked freely through the world? The turning point didn't come with a battle, nor with a grand speech, but with a whispered revelation among those who still dared to investigate. Ancient records, ignored for generations, began to be reinterpreted in light of recent events. They didn't speak of David as a simple hero, but as a point of containment, someone destined not only to defeat a giant, but to prevent certain forces from crossing a specific boundary. Goliath's victory then wasn't the problem itself. It was the absence of the defeat that should have occurred. Gradually, it became clear that the giant was never the true antagonist. He was a vessel, an inverted guardian, chosen not to protect, but to carry something that needed to remain restricted. By surviving, Goliath had fulfilled a function that no one consciously knew. The black stone found in the field wasn't an artifact of power, but a marker, a seal broken at the exact moment David fell. The twist was simple and terrifying. It wasn't Israel that had lost a war. It was the world that had lost its restraint. The shadow seen by the witness didn't follow Goliath. It inhabited him. And now, with the seal broken, this presence no longer needed to hide. It could influence kings, silence prophets, and reshape destiny without ever showing its true face. The giant simply opened the door. What crossed over didn't need physical strength to win. Fear didn't arrive as immediate panic, but as a shared certainty that no one could explain. It infiltrated the simplest conversations, averted glances, and postponed decisions. Entire cities began to act as if they were being watched, even without signs of armies or invasions. Gates were closed earlier. Bonfires kept burning all night, not to illuminate, but to ward off the feeling that something was moving in the darkness. Rumors spread rapidly. Kings falling ill for no reason. Leaders making decisions against their own people. Harsh judgments being made without emotion or mercy. The name Goliath was avoided, replaced by vague titles as if pronouncing it strengthened something undesirable. Fear became collective when different regions, without contact with each other, began to report the same omens, identical dreams, the same silent figure watching from above, the same feeling that the future had been stolen. It was no longer possible to deny that something invisible was orchestrating the chaos. The absence of resistance became the greatest symptom. People didn't fight, they didn't flee, they simply accepted. It was as if hope had been slowly drained, leaving behind a purposeless obedience. Some called it a curse, others, divine correction. But deep down everyone knew that this was not natural. The collective fear did not come from the war, but from the perception that no one was truly in control. And when an entire society accepts fear as the norm, something far more dangerous than a giant begins to rule. The theory began to circulate only in whispers, shared among the few who still dared to connect the dots. It was not taught, nor officially recorded because its mere formulation was considered dangerous. According to this theory, David was not chosen to win by chance, nor Goliath to lose. The battle was a ritual disguised as a confrontation, a necessary event to reaffirm ancient boundaries between the human and what exists beyond. By winning, David would have definitively sealed an influence that was trying to establish itself in the world through force and domination. Goliath's victory, therefore, represented not only a historical break, but a deliberate inversion of order. The forbidden theory suggested that God's silence was not abandonment, but reaction, a strategic retreat in the face of something that now operated outside the known rules. Some even older texts hinted that giants arose when certain cycles approached collapse, acting as catalysts, not villains nor heroes, but tools. Goliath, by winning, would have allowed this force to break free from the physical body and spread, becoming pure, invisible, and persistent influence. This idea was terrifying because it implied that humanity was not being punished, but tested again, unaware that the test had already been compromised. If the theory were true, then the greatest threat was not what had been unleashed, but the fact that no one else knew how to contain it, and perhaps never would have known. The search for a solution ended not with a discovery, but with collective exhaustion. Those who investigated for too long began to disappear, not violently, but silently, as if they had simply ceased to exist in the records and in memory. Scrolls were sealed, locations abandoned, and questions forbidden. The witness, marked from day one, was the last to be found. His body was intact, but his eyes reflected an absolute emptiness, like someone who had seen the end before it happened. There were no signs of struggle, only the certainty that the search had gone too far. The priests secretly concluded that nothing could be reversed. No ritual, sacrifice, or army could undo what had been activated in the Valley of Elah. Acceptance spread like an inevitable sentence. Kings began to rule with excessive caution, avoiding grand decisions, as if they feared drawing attention. The search ended because everyone understood the same thing at the same time. Seeking answers kept the door open. Silence, however oppressive, became a form of belated restraint. The legacy of Goliath's victory was not written in monuments or triumphal songs, but in silent choices made over generations. A world where the improbable ceased to be expected, where courage came to be seen as recklessness and faith as unnecessary risk. Stories of heroes diminished, transformed into vague legends, while narratives of strength and dominion became models to follow. The Valley of Elah was abandoned, not by declared curse, but because no one could bear to remain where hope had failed. The true legacy was not fear, but its normalization. Children grew up learning that giants win, that impossible challenges shouldn't be faced, that order is maintained through submission. And so, without chains or visible armies, the world became easier to control. A few still felt an inexplicable discomfort upon hearing the old story of David, even without knowing exactly why. It was like an inherited memory, a warning engraved too deeply to be completely erased. The legacy didn't promise immediate destruction, but something more subtle and lasting, a future where no one would rise up against the inevitable. And perhaps that was the ultimate victory. Not Goliath's victory over David, but the victory of the idea that certain forces should never be challenged because, once accepted, they no longer need to fight to win. The world wasn't saved, only suspended, and perhaps that suspension was all that remained. The end of the quest didn't bring peace, but a forced coexistence with uncertainty, with the constant feeling that something was watching, awaiting humanity's next wrong move. The revelation didn't happen before crowds, nor was it proclaimed aloud. She emerged slowly, connecting fragments that had previously seemed disconnected. What had been unleashed was not a new entity, nor a specific demon, but a condition, a state of silent domination that fed on the absence of resistance. Goliath's victory did not create evil, it merely removed the example that would prove it could be defeated. David was not important for who he was, but for what he represented, the rupture of inevitability. When he fell, the world lost proof that brute force could fail. The most disturbing revelation was this: nothing needed to be conquered by force from then on. Peoples would submit on their own. Leaders would choose the safest path, not the most just. Divine silence was not punishment, but consequence, because history had taken a turn where faith had become optional.